Thank you for coming out to the International Spy Museum this morning. I'm Chris Costa, the Executive Director of the museum, and I'm excited, very excited this morning in particular because of this talk. I'm excited about introducing our curator, our historian, Vince Houghton, and I'm very excited about this series as well as this specific topic. Vince has a PhD in diplomatic and military history from the University of Maryland. Yay, that's what I said. How about that? That was awesome. That was well-timed. I have a brand new grandson, so I'm going to teach him to do that as well. Back to Vince. His research has centered on U.S. scientific and technological intelligence in the Second World War and early Cold War period. He has taught extensively at the middle school, high school, and university levels, most recently at the University of Maryland, where he taught courses on the history of U.S. intelligence, of diplomatic history, the Cold War, and the history of science. Vince is a veteran of the United States Army and served in the Balkans Theater of Operations, where he worked closely with both civilian and military intelligence agencies in several capacities. Today, this morning, Vince will kick off a series, Caught in the Act. It's a joint program with the Smithsonian Associates and features stories of notable arrests, captures, executions, and expulsions from the 1960s through the present day. In this talk, Catching Che, Vince will specifically discuss the tactics that the CIA used in the operation to hunt down Che Guevara. So now I'd like to introduce Vince, but before I do that, just one aside, off script, I just want to make the point that many of those lessons that Vince is going to talk about remain universal today. And in a post-9/11 environment, we've employed many of those same tactics and strategies to do what is euphemistically known as manhunting. So I'm really excited to hear Vince today, and I think you'll really enjoy our program. So again, Vince Houghton.
Okay, good morning. Usually I'm the one introducing these things, so it's nice to be in front of you guys. Every so often there's something Cold War or Cuba related, and they pull me out of the dustbin to come talk about it. Che is one of these interesting figures that has really not only become a legendary more than anything else with a lot of people who just don't necessarily remember the time, but also even within those who would eventually hunt him down and capture him. He was this mixed figure where, as I'll talk about, the man who was finally responsible for CIA for finding him was a Cuban exile, somebody that Che helped to destroy his country, in his opinion, and just the respect between the two of them on Che's final minutes is pretty extraordinary. This is not something that this man, this CIA agent, would have given Fidel Castro or Raul Castro or anybody else who was involved in the Cuban Revolution, but Che was so pure in many respects. Pure in a bad way, as a lot of people would assume, but to him it was someone that you got where he was coming from. We'll talk a little bit about that today. So this is a passport from a middle-aged Uruguayan businessman named Adolfo Mena Gonzalez, who landed in La Paz, Bolivia in November of 1966. We'll give you a closer up view of what Adolfo looked like. Average, everyday, 50-something, 60-something, balding businessman going in and out of Bolivia like everybody else did at the time, even closer. Now, I want you to kind of close one eye and turn your head to the side a little bit and add a little bit of bushy beard to Adolfo, maybe a hat with a beret with a star on it, and kind of imagine this man not in this disguise that he's wearing right now. And normally he looked like that. So we do a lot of things on disguise here at the International Spy Museum, and actually one of our board members, well, two of our board members used to be chief of disguise at CIA, and both of them would be pretty astonished of this transformation. So Che actually thought he was pretty good. He had snuck into Bolivia. He had spent his whole life as a dreamier, romantic revolutionary, going on one adventure to the next. Even back when he was a kid, he was always thinking about, how can I get myself into some trouble? How can I do something to change the world? And he bounced from place to place. I mean, his real passport, if he was using one, would have stamps from 30, 40, 50 countries. all throughout Latin America, even going into Asia, certainly the Soviet Union. He wanted to make a difference everywhere he went. When he landed here, Adolfo/Che, in Bolivia in 1966, he had no idea that this would be his last big adventure. And so we're going to focus on this mission to finally catch Che. The man, really the myth, the legend. I know that's a trite kind of statement, but that's what Che really turns into. And for a lot of us today, well, I'm talking to the right audience. And I don't mean that, how do I say this without being insulting? Many of you might remember Che. You're not one of my college classes where they're like, who? Or they've heard of him because they've seen somebody wearing a $45 Che hoodie sweatshirt. So the legend of Che has gone in a really interesting direction because this guy was a staunch communist, a true believer. If you wanted to kind of look at Fidel and Che, if you go back to thinking about things like Lenin and Trotsky or Stalin and Trotsky, that's a really interesting dichotomy. You have Stalin, who was the true kind of pragmatist, the guy who cared about power and was willing to do just about anything to maintain that power. And then Leon Trotsky, the ideologue, the person who wanted pure and unadulterated communism, the real way. That's how Fidel and Che were in many respects. So Fidel was exactly this. He was a true pragmatist. He actually wasn't even a communist in the beginning, right? He was a born-again communist when he realized he needed the Soviet Union and no longer could count on the United States. So he read a bunch of Marx real quick and then came out starting to talk about nationalization of industry and Marxist Leninism and communism. Che was a true believer from the very beginning, which is what makes this even more ironic, right? Che is spinning at a rapid pace in his grave as everyone spends $45 on a Che sweatshirt. Right. Some kid going to Yale or Harvard paying $80,000 a year, their parents paying $80,000 a year to send someone wearing a Che sweatshirt. Now, this is kind of, it's got some good fashion sense going on. It's not too over. Or you could get this, right? This is a classy Che shirt. And if you're really, it's on sale too. This is a real website, the Che store. Usually it's $69, but $21 you can get your very own, whatever the hell that is, Che sweatshirt or it's t-shirt. And this isn't just for dumb college kids. Hollywood has really embraced this as well. Maybe 15 years ago, a movie came out called The Motorcycle Diaries. It was award-winning. It's actually a fantastic movie if you ignore the fact that it's about the guy who will become Che one day. And it's based on Che's memoir. He wrote several of them called The Motorcycle Diaries. And the movie was embraced by, let's call them the Hollywood elite, but even people like me watched it and said, you know what, this is a great movie. I kind of can identify with this guy. In many respects, we still can because he was a true believer. And then this is such a great casting. This is Benicio del Toro, not actually Che Guevara, right? So this is an actor in Steven Soderbergh's 6-hour version of a movie called Che. And Soderbergh is famous for making the Ocean's 11 movies and all these others, and he decided to embrace this legend of Che. And actually, this does a good job. If you're looking for one movie that is balanced enough to show the good and the bad of Che, this isn't terrible. This still really kind of celebrates his life a little more than he probably should, but it does a decent job showing at least the post-revolution chaos that Che was fully involved with. And then a really great recent example of this is this genius who at his West Point graduation, this is the United States Military Academy graduation, from May of this year, decided to rip open the gray uniforms that have been worn by West Point grads since 1802 or whatever it is, to reveal a Che shirt underneath, and then his ridiculous hat, "Communism will win." The kids these days, really, I mean, so the good news is he is no longer employed by the United States Army. The bad news is the fact that he went through 4 years at West Point and still had this warped sense of history. Look, I'm very left of center. I can look at Che Guevara and say, this is someone who has things in his life that we can emulate, like truly believing in a cause, whether or not you agree with the cause. But knowing history, this isn't you. This isn't what you should be doing. So let's start, before we jump right into how he was caught, let's actually talk about who he was. Who is Che? So Che is a nickname, in case you didn't know that. His name is Ernesto. Ernesto's a nice enough name, but I can understand why you'd want to go by Che. He was someone who was actually very accomplished. A lot of the Cuban revolutionaries, if you don't know the background, had extremely high education. Right? Castro was a lawyer. He actually had a law degree. Che was a doctor. He got a medical degree in Argentina. And in his youth, he even went to study medicine, but didn't really fit in anywhere. He didn't really understand who he wanted to be. He knew he wanted to go and be adventurous. And so in 1952, basically, he did a gap year to a degree. He was almost done with his medical degree, and instead he decided to go on a almost year-long journey of what he called discovery and awakening. And this is essentially what the Motorcycle Diaries memoir is all about. He traveled around South America, tried to find himself and try to figure out what he wanted to do with his life. So this is someone who had wanderlust, someone who just could not kind of figure out who he wanted to be when he grew up. In some cases, as he made his way through parts of South America, he really started to witness some of the injustices that were taking place at the time, right? In the 1950s and 1960s, these are not countries that are doing well economically. These are countries that had a massive rich-poor gap, countries where the rich and the elite and those that were actually governing the country were just filling their coffers with money and not actually giving back to the people. This is something that we tried to address, not all that successfully, in the 1960s under the Lyndon Johnson administration, the Alliance for Progress. We failed that too. So Che realized that these were not governments that were, even if you weren't a communist, you would look at these and go, man, these are corrupt governments. These are people who, the poor keep getting poorer, the rich keep getting richer. And this was a tour where he really started to kind of figure out his ideology, figure out what he truly believed. And you can see this quote, and I'll read it in case it's tough to see. After his trip, he's just a kid at this point. He said, "I will be with the people. I will dip my weapons in blood and craze with fury. I will cut the throats of my defeated enemies. I can already feel my dilated nostrils savoring the acrid smell of gunpowder and the blood of death to the enemy." He didn't know what the hell he was talking about at this point. I mean, he's still a kid. He really doesn't know what he's saying. This is just kind of very poetic. This is just, a kid kind of throwing out there, like, I'm going to kill my enemies and, like, drench their blood. But the seeds of the revolutionary that would become Che are there. And where this begins to turn into something different is during this time. He had spent 5 weeks in Bolivia and 9 months in Guatemala, where he was a firsthand witness of the overthrow of the left-leaning reformist president Jacob Arbenz by a CIA-backed coup. So he saw this firsthand. He watched what the North Americans, the imperialists, could do when they didn't like someone who could possibly step in and make a difference there. And this event really fixated his hatred of the United States. Right? He's basically just a teenager at this point, but he's just understood the United States in his mind was a power for evil in the Western Hemisphere. And by then he was kind of a convinced Marxist. This is somebody who read voraciously, and he really bought into the Marxist idea. And because he didn't know any better, he thought the Soviet Union was kind of the epitome of Marxist thought. This is still a time when people didn't quite understand what was happening inside the Soviet Union. There was this ideological kind of separation between reality and what people perceived as the reality on the ground in the Soviet Union. So Che looked at the Soviets as this embodiment of Marxist thought. And so the Soviets, of course, are not only the mortal enemies of the United States, but he watched firsthand the heavy hand of the United States in South America. And even he married a Guatemalan woman, a peasant, and if he had a son, he told everybody he intended to name his son Vladimir. That's how committed a Marxist we're talking about here. And at this point, he had decided to join the ranks of the Communist Party. He just hadn't figured out where. Right? He kind of opened. He was kind of taking applications, essentially, kind of traveling around to figure out somewhere in the world where he could put his skill set to the test by joining the Communist Party. But really, if we think about it and take a step back, despite his lofty ideals and kind of the big romantic vision he had of the world, he was really we kind of call him a bum. He was a drifter. He was somebody who was just kind of wandering around, taking pictures of things that interested him, and really working as an unpaid medical researcher. He was just doing little jobs, odds and ends here and there. And you could really kind of put him down as a rebel in search of a cause, right? He knew he wanted to do something special. He just didn't know where. And then, of course, he found his cause. He discovered that cause in the late summer of 1955, and when he met Fidel Castro in Mexico. This is a time when Fidel was trying to build his movement in Mexico before he would eventually move on to Cuba. And this, like we talked about before, is the perfect match. It is the Lenin and Trotsky. It is the ideologue with the pragmatist. It's the guy in Fidel that had the big picture, the idea about how are we going to go back and take over Cuba? How are we going to spread this revolution, with the idealistic dreamer who could think of the big, lofty ideals and couch it in such a way to recruit people to follow along. And this is really the match made in heaven for the Cuban Revolution. So this is actually, the man to his left is a man named Camilo Cienfuegos, who we don't know a lot about because he died right after the revolution, but he was one of the top leaders. And while in Mexico, Che distinguished himself. He realized that he was the outsider. It was Castro and a bunch of Cubans who were trying to come together to eventually invade Cuba and take over the revolution. Che, of course, was Argentinian. He was the outsider. So like many of us do when we find ourselves as the kind of the token person, the outsider, he worked twice as hard to try to ingratiate himself to the Cubans. He outperformed every one of them while training in Mexico. And this is a guy, we didn't talk about this, as a kid had heavy asthma. And actually his asthma carried with him for the rest of his life. So while they're running up and down mountains in Mexico, his asthma is, he's having asthma attacks, but he's still trudging on and pushing on because of his belief in the cause. And so he would eventually be included in the failed November 1956 invasion of Cuba by Castro. Castro brought 82 of the soldiers in Mexico on the Granma yacht. It was essentially a big motorboat where he shoved 82 people on it and landed in Cuba. And this was a massive failure. This was the purpose of overthrowing Batista, Fulgencio Batista, who was the president of Cuba. Batista saw him coming. It wasn't hard. It was a bunch of people shoved onto a yacht coming over from Mexico. And so a lot of the fighters were actually defeated. Actually, the vast majority of them were actually either killed or captured. Not Che, not Castro. The two of them ran into the Sierra Maestra Mountains, where they reformed and regrouped and began to recruit more and more people. Really, the people who survived this became the core of the Cuban Revolution that came later on. And Che was one of these men. He earned Castro's confidence so much that he was actually the first rebel out of all of them, not just the first non-Cuban rebel or the first non-Castro, to be given the rank of comandante by Fidel. Right? Even his own brother didn't get that rank until later on. So Che was held in such high regard as someone who was integral to the Cuban Revolution that he was given massive amounts of responsibility. And this paid off. Actually, in late 1958, Che took a group of Cuban revolutionaries and was able to derail a column train that was bringing very important supplies to Batista's army, and actually took over the city of Santa Clara, which was a key stepping stone to eventually get to Havana. So if you're looking at wars in history where like the penultimate battle, the one that led to the big victory, right? Santa Clara was that one. It led to the final assault on Havana, and Che was the one who helped win that battle. And so Che's win at the derailing of this train was really the final nail in the coffin for Batista. The final last hurrah was to get these resupplies and help to defend Havana, and Che was the one that helped to prevent that from happening. So by January of 1959, when Castro and his men marched into Havana, really there were three people recognized by all the Cuban revolutionaries, and actually a lot of people around the world, as the most powerful leaders in Cuba. And that were the Castro brothers themselves, Fidel and Raul Castro, and Che Guevara. He had really gone from being this asthmatic kid, this Argentinian who really didn't fit in with everybody else, to being one of the three most important people in the Cuban Revolution. And this sort of things kind of start to become problematic because he was held on such high regard. Once you win the revolution, then all of a sudden you have to start governing. It's one thing to defeat the powers that you're trying to fight against. It's another thing to actually create a government. I mean, in the United States, we had trouble with that, right? Think of the Articles of Confederation, all the craziness we went through in the very beginning. Well, Cuba was not even anywhere near as good a shape as we were. And so they had a lot of trouble trying to get off, off their butts at this point because they had very little going for them when it came to actually running a government. Castro wasn't a politician, he was a lawyer, he was a revolutionary. Che knew nothing about politics. So that didn't really matter all that much because you had to give Che a good job. And essentially what they did is, even though Che didn't know the first thing about banking, they put him in charge of Cuba's national bank. This is problematic, right? This is an economy that is in shambles. It's an economy that had been run essentially by the United States for the last several decades before this, right? That was the reason the revolution happened in the first place, was that the American industry had monopolized the economic system. Well, all of a sudden, the Cubans are in charge. So who do you put in charge of your economy? A doctor who has no experience whatsoever in economics or running a bank. They realized after not too long that this wasn't something that Che was necessarily capable of doing, so they made him Minister of Industries, because why not? It's got a really lofty title, and it's somebody that actually had a lot of power in this case. And Che was able to call for the full diversification of the Cuban economy. Now that for an economy like the United States, it's very diversified, that sounds like a good plan, right? We want to make sure that if one sector doesn't collapses, the whole economy doesn't come on with it. But Cuba had essentially a single economy for decades, right? It was sugar, or it was tourism, or it was the mob, right? Their economy was not something where all of a sudden you could create a massive industrial base, where you could create an economy that was not based on agriculture. This is not a first world country, right? It even isn't all that much today, but it certainly wasn't during the revolution. But Che was going to force this through. You know, to be damned, he was going to die trying to try to figure out a way to diversify the Cuban economy. And the problem was they had no money to do this. They couldn't start building factories. They couldn't start building economies. So Che really focused on volunteer work, because who doesn't want to work for free? And if you don't want to work for free in a communist government, too bad, you're working for free. But true to his ideals, he was right there with them. I mean, that was something that, again, you look at this guy and you're like, God, this guy's a prick. But at the same time, he's rolling up his sleeves. He's like, you know what, I'm going to volunteer too. I'm going to work without pay. I'm going to do all this. So he led by example. He was somebody that he worked endlessly at his ministerial job. He was the first one to arrive, the last one to leave. But he didn't know what the hell he was doing. And so he tried to make up for that by literally going to ground and helping the volunteers. He worked in construction jobs. He cut sugar cane out on the fields with everybody going, look, we can all do this together. We can all. Your minister of industry should be ministering or being in charge, not cutting sugar cane. You know, but the Cubans love this, right? He's a really good looking guy. He's got a really good sense of humor. His willingness to point out the revolution's shortcomings from an ideological perspective, right? He wasn't some yes man. He was willing to kind of call Castro out when he needed to. They loved him for it. They loved him for it. And really where it comes down to is they loved him for taking out the vengeance of the Cuban people on Batista's forces. And this is where the great legend of Che gets really cloudy. Che was in charge of essentially the mass summary executions of the high-level people under Batista's government. Hundreds and hundreds of people were rounded up and killed, shot, after the Castro regime took power. And Che was essentially the man in charge of all of this. It's one thing if you're a minister, and that's kind of the job you have, and you kind of have to be like, okay, I'll make sure the prisons are working the way they are. But most eyewitness accounts, and there aren't a lot of eyewitness accounts left because most of the eyewitnesses had a bullet in their head. Most eyewitness accounts say that Che took almost a sadistic pleasure in the executions and the interrogations. He was somebody, again, a true believer. And the Batista regime were people who were the enemy of everything communism stood for. So on one hand, you have this guy who tells jokes, and he's good looking, and he's out on the sugarcane fields cutting down sugarcane and saying, come on, guys, let's go. On the other hand, you have this man who kind of chuckled while his enemies were being executed in front of him. And this dichotomy is really interesting in the Che ideas. What about foreign policy? Well, this is where Che becomes a prominent face of the revolution. This is where the t-shirt ideas kind of pop up in a very early time. Che's reputation outside of Cuba was even better than his reputation inside of Cuba. He became a hero of the left. And that's not like the left around the world. That's not about just Marxists. and revolutionaries around the world. He became a hero of the left here in the United States. The radical groups, they use those terms themselves. I'm not going to call them that. The new left, like the Students for the Defense of the Students for Democratic Society, Tom Hayden's group, SDS, some of the radical new leftists in the United States that become like the Weathermen, really idolized Che and the way that he was a true ideologue. And of course, at the time, they didn't know that he was a murdering ideologue, and that he was rounding up people and killing them after essentially show trials. And I'm not sure they would have cared all that much. You know, look, I'm not of this generation. I almost certainly would have been with Tom Hayden and crew. But even I'm self-aware enough to know that we have a good habit of saying, oh, I don't see what's going on. I have no idea what's happening. And even if Hayden and team of SDS or the Weathermen knew that Che was so involved in some of these summary executions, they probably would have looked beyond that. Because some of the people they idolized, they knew. And Ho Chi Minh's a good example of this. One part of what Che's job is this is a time period of world revolution, or at least there are places around the world that are pushing for this kind of revolutionary reform. And Fidel Castro declared his readiness to support these revolutions around the world. Essentially, Che was his minister. Che was the guy who would speak in front of the United Nations, like what we're seeing here. Che was the man that Fidel would send to these places to say, what do you need? How do you need us to support you? What do we need to do? And so Che really became the most visible advocate of this commitment of Fidel Castro to spread the Cuban Revolution around the world. That's the good side. But eventually, what really is the breaking point in the relationship between Che and Castro was, like we talked about, Castro was a pragmatist. Castro was somebody that would do whatever it took to stay in power, embrace whatever ideology it took to stay in power, do anything, whether it's consistent with communism or consistent without, to stay in power. Che was the ideologue. So Castro actually put the brakes on some of this revolution around the world. And Che didn't like that idea. Che actually became disillusioned with the pace of change, and particularly with the Soviet Union. Right? This is a time in the early 1960s under Khrushchev where the Soviets were saying, slow down. All right? We want to try to have a decent relationship with the United States. This is, we're talking about time around the Cuban Missile Crisis or right after the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is a time when Khrushchev is saying, look, we're pretty happy trying to keep our countries that we have within the Soviet sphere working toward a common goal, right? If we're around fighting around the world, then all of a sudden the Americans will be more interested. We want to have a good relationship. And so Che actually turned against the Soviets. This was somebody who was 100% enamored with the idea of the Soviet Union, and he became disillusioned. And he attacked Moscow every chance he could. Every international forum, he said the Russians are moving too slowly. The Russians have completely abandoned the ideals of Marx. And if from the background history at this time, there's another very important communist country in the mid-1960s that's starting to assert its power, China, and starting to split with the Soviets. Chinese under Mao were arguing for a worldwide revolution, arguing for spreading the revolution around the world. The Soviets were saying, slow down. We need to exist within this international forum. And so Che is looking at this going, I thought you guys were the ones that I should emulate. I thought you guys were the ones that truly understood the ideals of Marxism, but it turns out it's these other guys. The problem was Cuba had aligned itself, not with the Chinese, had aligned itself with the Soviets. So after Khrushchev pulled the nuclear missiles out of Cuba, after the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, Guevara went ballistic. And he actually openly questioned Moscow's commitment to communism. Now, you can do this from Cuba. You certainly don't want to do this right outside Red Square in 1962. But it was really enough that Castro had a decision to make. This was his friend for almost a decade at this point. This is one of the most important people in Cuba. This was the ideological founder of the Cuban Revolution. But he was someone that's really getting in the way of Cuba becoming the state that it needed to be, right? They didn't have a lot of friends left. The Soviets were there to support them with food, support them with weapons, to support them with economic aid. And Che was possibly getting in the way of this by taking every opportunity he could to speak out against the Soviets. Now to our credit, we knew what the hell was going on, which is surprising sometimes. The CIA understood the ramifications of this split. And so there is a memorandum in 1965, so this is right as it's happening, that was written by a young CIA analyst named Brian Littell. And Littell now lives down in Miami. He works at the University of Miami. He's written a bunch of books on this. But he was pretty prescient on this idea. And this is a long, long document, so I'm not going to put everything in front of you. But there's an interesting section that I pulled out for you. If you look at the second sentence, it says, meanwhile, Castro has lost faith in Guevara's theories and may have already decided against his dogmatist views in favor of the revisionist economic school headed by other Cubans. This is a pretty strong statement, right? And the CIA is saying, lost faith. Like, Castro's completely pushed him to the side. He's choosing others against Che. And so this second sentence in the whole document itself means that not only are these things kind of happening behind the scenes inside Cuba, but they're happening so openly that the CIA, who has no assets whatsoever inside Cuba, is picking up on this so blatantly that they're writing intelligence analysis of it at the time it's actually happening. This was coming to a head. This was getting to the point where Che would either need to get in line or he needed to get the hell out of there. And the answer is, in 1965, he disappeared, vanished. So some of you may or may not know, that's Carmen Sandiego. Yes, okay. So this is really where the CIA they thought they had their kind of hands around this. Like, we get what's going on inside Cuba. We understand this dynamic. You know, they really said one way or the other, Che's either going to need to kind of ship up or ship out, and then Che gone. And the CIA is like, what just happened? Where the hell is Che? Fidel wasn't talking for 6 months. Fidel Castro kept his silence, didn't say anything about where Che had went. By October of 65, he revealed the contents of a letter that he had kept secret. And essentially, in this letter, Che had written to Fidel. We don't know for sure whether or not it was Che just deciding to write this letter on his own, or if it was kind of like here in Washington where someone resigns and they write a letter of resignation where they're like, hey, you're resigning and you're going to write a letter. But Che basically, in his letter, renounced all his Cuban posts. He said, I resign from all the different government jobs I have here in Cuba. He gave up his Cuban citizenship, which he had been granted because of the revolution, and said he was going to, quote, leave Cuba to, quote, fight imperialism in new fields of battle. I have fulfilled the part of my duty that tied me to the Cuban Revolution, and I say goodbye to you, to the comrades, to your people who are now mine. And then he left. Now, Castro wasn't all that upset. It was, I think of kind of Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory with Gene Wilder going, no, don't leave, please. This is a huge solution to a problem that Castro had, right? He was sitting there going, look, this is like my best friend, but my best friend is going to get us all in a lot of trouble because he won't shut his damn mouth and criticizing my sugar daddy, the Soviet Union. Well, now Che is off to fight wars in other places. And Castro's like, okay, I'm not worried about this anymore. As long as he doesn't kind of pop his head up and cause trouble, I'm good to go. And this is important because by the late 1960s, Cuba was even more absorbed in the Soviet sphere of influence. They were entirely dependent on Soviet support, and Che was becoming a significant liability. The problem was no one knew, even inside Cuba, I mean, Castro knew, but he wasn't saying where Che had gone. And this is where the rumor reel really popped up. There were ideas that maybe he was in North Africa or he was in the Middle East. He could have been in Vietnam. There were sightings of him in Vietnam, of this bearded man. Maybe he was dead. That's how Castro usually solved his problems. So maybe, his disappearance to go around the world was just the fact that Che was now in a shallow grave somewhere in a Cuban tobacco plant. You know why Cuban cigars are so good? Do you want to know why Cuban cigars are so good? All right, they were actually, the tobacco fields were planted on old cemeteries. So all the nutrients from the old cemeteries. Anyway, so sometimes, like the mob puts people out in Vegas or in shallow grade underneath Giant Stadium or wherever. The Cubans use tobacco fields. And so while you're smoking that Cohiba, you might be smoking Che. No, he didn't end up in a tobacco field. He just kind of vanished off the face of the planet. So the CIA realizing how much he is an icon to leftist movements around the world, are scrambling to find out where is this guy. And you can actually see in the documents that there are reports coming in of sightings of Che around the world. And these are pretty disparate areas, right? You have sub-Saharan Africa, you have North Africa, you have all the way in East Asia and Southeast Asia. So he's kind of popping up here and there. Now, where he ended up popping up was somewhere people weren't really looking, and that was the center of Africa. In what is now today called the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which is, other than North Korea's official name, the DPRK, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, is the most misleading name of any country. The Democratic Republic of the Congo is not democratic, it's not a republic, it is in the Congo, so they got one word right. At the time, the Congo was the perfect place for Che. This was a place that had just found its independence a couple years earlier, when Belgium, which had been running the Congo as a colony for decades, allowed it to have its independence. And so this is in 1960-ish when they declare their independence. Now, most places in Central Africa that can declare their independence might just be kind of, all right, go do what you got to do, enjoy yourself, but not the Congo. This is an incredibly important place because of its natural resources. The Congo was chock full of natural resources: gold, diamonds, copper, cobalt, all these things that the superpowers really need to get their hands on. And most importantly, it was the world's largest supply of highly, not quite enriched yet, but high quality uranium. So we're talking about the 1960s, maybe a nice juicy supply of uranium could come in handy for some of the superpowers. And so no one was just going to sit by and let the Congo do whatever the hell it wanted to. So there were multiple smaller groups inside the Congo that were fighting for different independence or revolutionary movements. One of them were the Simbas. So the Simbas led a brutal rebellion against the people that the Belgians had left in charge after independence, funded, armed, and supported by the Soviets and their allies. So this is a leftist revolution by the Simba rebels. They were brutal. Their tactics included going into places and just murdering anything that was alive. Men, women, children, dogs, cats, anything that was moving around, the Simbas murdered. Much in the same vein, the best way I can describe the Simbas is what you saw in Rwanda during the 1990s, where people would go in and just kill for the sake of killing. They would find ways to intimidate other areas by what they had done in the last city. So this is brutal. And this was a time when most people weren't paying attention to this area of the world, except the CIA was. And the CIA reacted much the way that we'd hoped they would have in the 1990s. We actually sent operatives down into the Congo area to form a navy. And the reason to form a navy is, see this lake? So Tanzania was actually one of the I'll be loud enough. Tanzania was actually the marshalling point to help push supplies into the Congo for the Soviets. So they had to go across this lake. And if you could cut off access across this lake, you could stop supplies from getting into the Congo. And how do you control the lake? Well, the CIA sent a navy. Not a big navy. They weren't sending destroyers, and there's no aircraft carriers. They sent a navy of swift boats. Now, that was a term that a lot of us didn't know a whole lot about until, let's say, 2004 time. These were these small patrol boats that were able to operate on lakes and rivers. They didn't have to have necessarily a lot of depth for the body of water to move around effectively. And so swift boats were sent in to shoot the living crap out of anything that was trying to come across that lake. And in many cases, these were Soviet-supplied weapons that are trying to be sent in to the Congo. By happenstance, this is a lucky happenstance, they were able to acquire, the CIA was able to acquire a lot of Cuban boat crews to help man their swift boats. There were already Cubans actually there. There was a group called the Makasi, which I have up there. Makasi were Cuban pilots that were operating in the area as the Air Force for the anti-Simba group. They were people who had flown in the Bay of Pigs invasion, people who were part of the Cuban Air Force back in the day. Now they were working for the CIA. But air power alone is not going to solve your problem. But in wonderful happenstance, there was a pretty big screw-up here in the United States, or in the Florida Straits between the United States and Cuba. We had been allowing Cuban boat crews to go shoot up just about any target of opportunity near Cuba and outside the waters of Cuba. This was part of an operation run out of Miami in a place called JM Wave, which is the Miami CIA station. And at one point, the Miami CIA station controlled the third largest navy in the Caribbean behind the United States and Cuba. And what part of the job of this navy was to smuggle supplies into Cuba, but it was also if you ran into Cuban ships, either bringing in weapons or Cuban ships doing anything of kind of transporting, they were authorized to shoot them with 50 cals and rocket launchers and everything else. Well, there's a little bit of a screw up where they thought they were shooting up a Cuban supply ship full of weapons, and it turned out they were shooting up a Swiss supply ship full of medicine and food for the Cuban people. So the international condemnation, they kind of had to shut this program down. Well, wonderfully for the African operation, this is right when they needed Cuban boat crews to help prevent weapons from going into the Congo. So all of those teams ended up being shipped along with their boats to Africa to create this navy that would be instrumental in preventing Cuban Soviet supplies, weapons, and resources from getting into the Congo. And there's a good book about this, which talks about how they got the boats over there. They essentially cut them up into little pieces, shoved them inside the aircraft, flew them over there, and then put them all back together, and were able to ship essentially an entire navy, again, of swift boats, so we're not talking about aircraft carriers, entire navy from Florida to the Congo in a couple days. And they had the navy back up and running. They're shooting up supply ships within a couple days. Pretty extraordinary. They didn't know at the time that the guy they were fighting against was none other than Che. So the Cubans were there to actually help the United States fight against another communist revolutionary power, and just so happened they found out that they were fighting against not only Che, but Che had brought with him a bunch of Cuban regular soldiers, a bunch of people left with him and went over to the Congo. And this, talk about a dream come true for these Cuban exiles. They were kind of mopey that they were being sent to the middle of Africa. They're like, really? Like, we want to help liberate Cuba. We want to continue the fight. And they're like, no, you can't. You screwed up. You got to go somewhere far away so that no one pays attention. And then all of a sudden, they're monitoring radio traffic of these boats that are crossing from Tanzania into the Congo, and they're hearing Spanish. And they're hearing Cuban accented Spanish. I don't know how many Spanish speakers we have, but anyone who's fluent in Spanish can pick. There's accents just like there is in the United States, right? So I can tell someone from Alabama or somebody's from California. Well, Spanish has those accents too. So these Cubans picked up, these are Cubans, right? These aren't Argentinians, these aren't Bolivians, these are Cubans that all of a sudden we're fighting against. And so that kind of gave them this extra oomph to go fight this battle. And then all of a sudden, they start hearing these rumors from across the water that the Cubans aren't being led by just anybody. The Cubans are being led by Che. And eventually they hear him on the radio. So these are the first guys to tell the CIA that, hey, we know where Che is. Che is in the Congo. And that's kind of random, right? You know, you think intelligence comes from really unique and interesting places. We have, at the time, the NSA listening to lots of stuff happening around the world. We have the world's greatest intelligence agency, the CIA. We have satellites in space by the mid to late 1960s, all looking for this guy. And it's a bunch of Cuban refugees who weren't supposed to be there, who are the ones that discover that Che is finally in the Congo. Now, while he's there, he writes a diary. And the diary is something that you can read today. And it gives a wonderful play-by-play, not only of what Che was doing in the Congo, but also what we were doing. Right? So there are people who've written books about this, talking about the CIA in the Congo. And Che's diary is one of the greatest resources for this because he was on the other side. So you have a day-to-day version of what the Americans and the Cubans were doing against Che, because Che's writing that stuff in his diary. He's talking about how difficult it is to move supplies across because the Yankees are over there shooting up our supply lines. And really, it showed that the CIA and the Cubans were giving Che way more than he could handle, along with the McCossie, right? So there's still Cuban Air Force guys who are shooting up these things as well. And the crazy thing is, we almost got him in the Congo. We're sitting there listening every day to the radio calls, trying to figure out, okay, we can find this guy. He doesn't know that we're listening in. He doesn't know how fast we can react. So maybe we can catch him trying to get across the water. And we did, or at least we almost did. We certainly said, all right, Che's on the water right now. We can go get him. Let's go get him. And actually 2 boats ran into each other. They were trying to go so fast. They actually ran into each other. I mean, there are a couple other things too. The Makasi came in and didn't expect to see the 2 boats where they were and actually shot up their own ship. So we were that close to catching Che in the mid-1960s in the Congo. He was able to escape, but his first big foray into spreading the Cuban Revolution outside of Cuba was an abject failure. It was a complete and total humiliating loss. So he returned to Cuba, kind of with his tail tucked between his legs and his head kind of, Castro gave him a little bit of I told you so, and said, hey, look, I get that you tried, but how about getting in the program? But Che didn't want to do that. Che actually started arguing for trying to bring the Cuban Revolution to his native Argentina, try to bring it down south. But neither the Argentinian Communist Party nor Castro approved this decision. Talk about getting rebuked, right? And Castro, we understand, is saying, hey, look, we talked about this already, right? The Soviets have told us don't run around and try to spread communism. But even the Argentinians themselves, right? The Argentinian Communist Party was like, no, I don't think we want your brand coming down here. But then Fidel stepped in. Look, Fidel was realizing that yet again, Che would be a possible problem for him. So he's like, look, why don't you try Bolivia? Try to start a continental revolution, right? Bolivia is, we'll talk about why Bolivia makes sense in a second, but Bolivia might be the perfect place for you to go. Try to replicate what was done in Cuba, because Bolivia is extremely poor and their government is extremely corrupt, right? The 2 ingredients really for starting this leftist revolution. You have a proletariat, the poor workers, the people whose economic woes are going to eventually make them rise up and do something about it, and the perfect target for them to rise up against, a corrupt government that just kept getting richer and richer while the poor kept getting poorer and poorer. And so we kind of picked this apart. Bolivia made a ton of sense. Even for Che, he understood this. In his diaries, he talked about the fact that, like, Bolivia makes tons of sense because, first, it's of lower priority than the Caribbean basin countries to the United States, right? There is not a lot of United States policymakers looking at Bolivia and going, we need to make sure that nothing bad happens there. Right? I can make a joke about some American policymakers finding Bolivia on a map, but I won't. Just kind of did, but that's okay. But Bolivia is something that even today we don't talk a lot about. It's right smack dab in the middle. It's not Brazil, right? It's not the economic giants. It's not Argentina, which is a relatively modern European-style country. It's poor. It's mountainous. They're not something that American security interests tend to get too worried about. And actually, he quotes that the Yankees wouldn't concern themselves with Bolivia, so it's a perfect target. Second, as we talked about, Bolivia's social conditions and poverty were the perfect recipe for what Che was thinking. It's susceptible to communist ideology. These are the people that would be most willing to hear the message of Marxism. That really it's the poor that should be in charge. It's the workers that should be, not these fat cat corrupt guys who are making themselves richer in their castles. It's you. You're the ones working the fields. You're the ones that can control industry. It was essentially ripe for the taking. And then finally, if you can look at the map here, Bolivia shares a border with 5 other countries. It's smack dab in the middle, which if this works, right, if Bolivian revolution works, you can easily spread it throughout the rest of Latin America, South America. You know, if the guerrillas are successful, you have options to move into different places, including Brazil, including Argentina. So it could be a jumping off point for spreading the revolution. And if you want to think really cynically, because it was surrounded by 5 countries, it could help them get the hell out of Dodge if things got bad. With a lot of escape routes. It's not like they could be pushed up against the ocean. There's a lot of ways they could escape if they needed to. So let's go back to our friend Adolfo. The Bolivians weren't necessarily fooled by this. They even had the technology at the time to kind of figure out, all right, this isn't really some dude. This is Che. And so very quickly as he came in, people figured out what was happening. And you can see this is actually one of their police reports here where it shows the forehead, the ears, everything else. was actually Che Guevara. So Che's guerrilla group, numbering about 120. So it's not big. This is not a massive army. This is 120 guerrillas. Were well equipped. They had, Castro said, go away, don't come back. But here's some weapons. Here's some resources. Go do what you need to do in Bolivia. And actually, in the very beginning, they scored a number of significant successes against the Bolivian army. The Bolivian army was not well trained. They were not prepared for Cuban revolutionaries to show up on their door and start shooting stuff up. From March to August of 1967, so a good, think about August is 8, so 5 months, Che and his guerrilla band basically did whatever the hell they wanted to. They struck pretty much at will against the Bolivian armed forces. They were able to get a string of victories. And I'm not sure I'm emphasizing this, 120 men. The Bolivian armed forces were made up of 20,000 soldiers. And Che and his men were able to do whatever the hell they wanted to. Not only does that show one thing about how poorly equipped and trained the Bolivian army was, but also shows Che has a really good force. Right? These are battle-hardened revolutionaries that came with Che from Cuba, many of whom actually had served with him during the Cuban Revolution up in the Sierra Maestra Mountains. And so it's not a fair fight at first. Even though they're dramatically outnumbered, they do hit-and-run tactics. They're up in the mountains. They never allow themselves to get into a straight-up fight, because 20,000 versus 120 wouldn't go all that well if you're across a battlefield. But if you're doing hit-and-runs, if you're disappearing into the mountains, you can do some serious damage. And to give you an idea, during these 5 or 6 months, the guerrillas only lose one single killed in action during 6 months. This is as good as it gets. Right? These are ghosts. These are people that would pop out, they would shoot up a convoy or an armored column or a group of troops and then disappear. And the Bolivians are dying left and right. Then things went bad. One reason why is the Bolivian recruits that they had been trying to recruit while inside of Bolivia resented taking orders from the Cubans. All right, so Che came in, we're calling Che a Cuban just for the sake of it. Che and his men came in and started barking orders at these guys. And eventually it became resentful. Even though they were incredibly successful in the battlefield, they were proud. These were, I don't want to stereotype, these were machismo Latin men, right? That they weren't going to take orders from these people who had just parachuted in, not literally, but I'm using that figuratively, to tell them what to do. And that would have been not as problematic because they were winning, but eventually the locals turned their back on the rebels. The local population began to see the rebels as being more problems than they were worth, particularly because the rebels would swoop in on a town and decide they needed to be fed and essentially take all the food and the resources from the town and not be able to pay for it. Essentially, Che would be like, you'll be paid when we win. And for a while, this was nice, right? For a while, the poor people in Bolivia were like, go get him, Che. But eventually it was like, okay, we got to eat ourselves. When are you going to win? This is a lot of talk, and eventually there's not a lot of action here. Then you have politics. You would think in a country like Bolivia that has millions of people, there would be a bunch of communists, and there were, right? There was our relatively large communist party already in Bolivia, but they were, like other places, Moscow-oriented, right? They looked to the USSR as their model. They looked to the USSR for the support of their Communist Party. So they weren't going to support Che. Che had burned that bridge. He had set it on fire again. He had stomped up and down on the ashes. He had swept the ashes into the sea. There was no one who wanted to keep working with the Soviets that was going to do anything to help Che. Now, that's fine, because theoretically, Che might have a backer back in Cuba, in Fidel, that would keep sending him supplies, keep sending him help. But Castro cut him off. And I didn't put a slide up here, but the slide, if you would be like, I can't hear you, I can't hear you. Castro basically said, we have no communications. So Che kept calling and calling and calling. And after the fact, Castro, I didn't hear anything. Like we couldn't. And this is, if you've been to Bolivia or you know the topography of it, it's mountainous, it's high up. There's no way that those signals weren't getting back to Cuba. In fact, people have gone back and tested it using 1960s radio technology, and you can hear it clear as day back in Havana. So Castro was basically just ignore it. Ignore it and maybe he'll get himself killed or he'll go away. So gave him no support, although he could have done it very easily. He could have shipped in support from a number of different directions. He could have backed Che up. He could have made sure that Che had the latest weapons. He could have made sure Che had food. He could have even sent in reinforcements if he wanted to help Che, but he refused. And not only did he didn't refuse, he just never answered. It's one thing to say, you know what, you're on your own, but Che just kept thinking, he can't hear us, keep calling, keep calling. Fidel will come through. I believe in Fidel, and Fidel's like, just ignore the guy, maybe he'll go away. And then, there's a very prominent Che biographer who kind of summed this up. He said, Fidel did not send Che to his death in Bolivia. He simply allowed history to run its course. And that's a really, I wanted to steal that, but no, I'll give credit to it. There's an author who wrote that, but it's a perfect sentence, a perfect sentiment. That no, there is a conspiracy theory among the Che, true believers today, that Fidel wanted him to die in Bolivia and sent him to his death. He knew that when Che decided to go fight in Bolivia, that the end was near for him. Because what really turned the tide, and what Fidel had heard about, because Fidel's the Cuban intelligence service was the best in the world per capita. They had eyes and ears everywhere. In particular, in the United States, the Bolivian government had all the support they needed. So these are Che's 120 fighters. So the support, where do you think it came from? Yeah, us, right? So Che with his 120 fighters are doing their damnedest to try to win, 119 at this point, remember they lost somebody, are doing their damnedest to try to win this war. Castro's offering no support. The Bolivian communists are offering no support. Sure, the Bolivian army doesn't know what it's doing, but all of a sudden, we get involved. And once we find out that Che is in Bolivia, the United States government sent in CIA and actually Green Berets into Bolivia. The Green Berets grabbed an elite battalion of Bolivian Army Rangers and trained them up in counter-guerrilla warfare, turned them into essentially one of the world's most elite fighting forces, skilled in jungle warfare, skilled in fighting against insurgencies and hit-and-run tactics, and then set them loose on Che's men. This is really problematic. This is something where you turn the tide, right? We had talked about the fact that these 20,000 Bolivian Army soldiers didn't know how to shoot straight, didn't know what they were doing. All of a sudden, you're sending the Green Berets, train up this Bolivian Army unit to become essentially Green Berets of their own. So Che's in big trouble. And then we get Felix. You could argue that this was the single most damaging thing to Che's longevity. A man named Felix Rodriguez, still alive today. He's in D.C. every so often, comes up every couple months. He lives in Miami. Felix has a pretty extraordinary background. He was only 17 when the Cuban Revolution happened. He wasn't actually in Cuba at the time. He was in high school in New Jersey here in the United States. He had been sent overseas as his family could afford to send him to a good high school. But very quickly, he moved to Miami with everyone else and joined up with the group that would later become the force that would invade during the Bay of Pigs invasion, Brigade 2506. He was recognized as special from the very beginning. He was part of a team in Brigade 2506 called the Gray Teams. So if you know the history, I'll give it very briefly. Cuban exiles land on the beaches at Playa Girón in the Bay of Pigs, and Castro's there waiting for them. And so there's a pitched battle where the men who are the Cuban refugees lose. A lot of them are captured. Felix wasn't there. He wasn't part of that. He'd actually gone in days earlier before the invasion as part of these infiltration teams. He had landed surreptitiously. He had landed secretly and was working to try to create supply lines, to work with the local Cuban resistance, to try to, essentially was being a spy, working ahead of time, which in the end is what saves his life. Because when the battle goes bad, he's in a great position to kind of get away. And he does. He goes and he gets in with the Venezuelan embassy and stays there for a little while until he can be finally smuggled back to the United States. After that, after the Bay of Pigs invasion failed, he got another chance to be involved. He had a middle of the night, CIA knocks on the door and says, "We need you to get ready to go into Cuba on a moment's notice." I was like, "What's the mission?" It's like, "We're going to parachute you in, and then we want you to laze." It's a fancy way. Essentially, you take a laser indicator. There's a way that we can drop bombs on very, very specific targets by having them pick up a laser and go in. This technology we saw during Desert Storm. It's actually been around for quite some time. So they wanted him to go paint, is what the phrase we'd use, targets inside Cuba. And he's like, well, what targets am I talking about? Like, we'll let you know as we get closer. The day of his eventual infiltration, they let him know is there are nuclear missile sites inside Cuba that you're going to paint and we're going to go blow up when we send in the airstrike. So obviously he didn't go in, but if the invasion had taken, if the actual Kennedy blockade of the Cuban Missile Crisis hadn't worked and we had started bombing Cuba, Felix would have already been in there painting these missile sites so that we can actually find them. This is an extraordinary guy. Then when that stops, he's helping these forces that are shooting up these ships. He was actually on the radio the night that the ship was shot up, the ship bringing in medicine and supplies that the Cuban Navy, our Cuban Navy, actually shot up by accident. So very quickly he was like, oh crap. And then eventually he got the call that he had been waiting for his entire life, at least since he was 17 years old. We want you to go catch Che Guevara. I can imagine the feeling, right? This is the guy who helped destroy his country. This is the guy who single-handedly, in many cases, murdered all the people that were the leaders of this country beforehand. I mean, put yourself in his shoes. Let's say the United States, I know it's far-fetched, we kind of have to think about, the United States falls to some revolutionaries. And they line up, I'm going to say they line up Congress and kill everybody. I'm not sure all of us would have been so sad about that. So this story isn't really going in the right direction. So his country is taken away from him. And his family, which had been there for generations, lose all their property. And all his friends and friends' families lose everything they'd built up over generations. People are murdered. People are dying trying to escape. And one of the architects of his country's fall, he has a chance to single-handedly go and catch. This is the dream come true for Felix. And so he jumps all over it. Talk about the dream and all this. So jumps all over it, takes the opportunity. Oh, this is afterwards. I can give you a little of his background afterwards too. After this mission, which we'll tell you about in a second, I don't know why I put this slide out of order, but I'll say it anyway. After this mission, he goes to Vietnam. Well, actually volunteers several times to go to Vietnam as a contractor for CIA. He trains units called provisional reconnaissance units. Essentially, these are Vietnamese that are sent behind enemy lines into nasty territories to, let's not use the word assassinate, let's use the word liquidate North Vietnamese targets of opportunity, for which, because he led these teams, he was called in front of the Church and Pike Committee in 1975, the Committee on Assassination, in which he told them he didn't purposely do anything himself. Got himself caught up accidentally in the Iran-Contra scandal, the 1980s. He had retired or left CIA, was working as a civilian in El Salvador, working against the revolution, the Communist Revolution in El Salvador, and was called by Oliver North to kind of help out. Didn't like North very much, so again, good judge of character, I guess, to a degree, and said, no, I'm not doing this. This is kind of a skeezy operation here, but still got pulled in for the Iran-Contra hearings because his name appeared on a lot of different documents. And then eventually would become the president of the Brigade 2506 Foundation down in Miami, where he still lives. There's a little bit of background, Felix. I'm giving this background. The new museum, we're actually going to have a good profile on him. He's a really good dude. He's like, got to be like 90 now. But his stories are extraordinary. Okay, so in June of 1967 is where we picked this up. So we're going to kind of talk about a couple months here and slow down a little bit because it's important to kind of get this path correct. In June of 67, Felix receives a phone call from a CIA handler, Larry. We don't even know Larry's last name now, even though it's been now 50 years, who proposes this special assignment. Go find Che. Use your skills in unconventional warfare, counter-guerrilla tactics, communications, go get him. And so by the end of August, he lands. And this is a great, interesting timing because this is the point where the Bolivian Army, this special forces group of Army Rangers that's trained by the United States, scores its first major military victory. against Che's forces. They wipe out a full 1/3 of Che's men, right? So this is not just a bunch of people getting wounded. You talk about casualty rates being like 35, 40%. 1/3 are dead. Kill 1/3 of his forces. That's a bad day if you're really only running around with 120, 130 people. Worse than that is a man named Jose Castillo Chavez, who is more popularly known as Paco, is captured as the guerrillas are forced to retreat. So Paco's wounded. He can't get away with everybody else, and he's captured. Paco is someone who has been very close to Che during this entire time. And Felix's first stop is to interrogate Paco. This is where you might think, especially based on the last 15 years, that the CIA would use very heavy-handed techniques in getting Paco to talk. You had a man who was wounded. You could make his life a living hell. You could make him feel very uncomfortable to enhance your ability to interrogate him. Felix went the opposite. Felix spent 2 full weeks with Paco and went with what we now know to be the most effective interrogation method, this rapport building. He sat down with him. Paco thought he was going to be killed. Paco thought, like everybody else, he would be killed. But Felix treated him like a person. He cleaned him up, made sure doctors treated his wounds, actually got him a haircut. He'd been in the mountains. He hadn't had a haircut for a while, made sure he got to shave. Let him send a letter to his family. Right? Paco's family was worried about him. He had disappeared, thought he was dead. Felix made sure that a letter would get through to his family. And he talked to him man to man. Right? They sat down, they built rapport. And Felix sat down and started talking about what he loved about Cuba, why he was there doing what he was doing. Right? Paco had some ideology behind it. Che certainly had an ideology behind it. But instead of being like, you're evil, you're a bad guy, Felix sat down and said, here's what I love about Cuba. Here's why I'm here right now. And here's what Che took away from me. And through this conversation, it really started to get through to the fact that these weren't just Yankee stooges. These weren't just American, CIA people. These are people that truly believed in what they were doing just as much as Che and his men. And so Felix was able to get across this idea of what communism had really done to his country. So this opened up Paco to start talking about what was happening in Che. Now, at the same time, they had captured one of Che's top lieutenant's diaries. They didn't capture the lieutenant. They got the diary that was left behind. And so Paco and Felix sat down and started going through the diary together and talking about what different things meant, what was actually going on this day-to-day basis. And there was a huge revelation inside of this that Paco was able to let Felix know about. And that's how Che's forces were laid out on the battlefield, how they moved from place to place. And Che had decided to split his forces into 3 parts. A vanguard, so a forward group, a reconnaissance unit, the people who would be sent forward to find where the bad guys are. A main body, so the main part of the army. And then a rear guard, so people to make sure no one sneaks up on you. This is not revolutionary, for lack of a better term. This is something that a lot of armies do. But by understanding this, this made all the difference in the way Felix set the trap eventually for Che. What they realized is that if they found the vanguard, if they found the people in front, they could move their forces in the area very quickly, and eventually Che would walk right into their trap, would come straight to them. And this is not because the vanguard is a couple minutes or a couple hours ahead of the main body, because Bolivia is so mountainous, because it's so hard to actually traverse. The vanguard could only be 300-400 meters in front of the main body, which is about what you would do, but it could take you the better part of a day to cross 300-400 meters when you're going straight up into the mountains. So the vanguard, if you found them, you knew you probably had the better part of a day, maybe 12 hours, to get your forces into the area to set up an ambush for the main body. And we assume that Che would be in the main body. That's where you put the leader, so they don't get themselves killed. So this was revolutionary. This was something that really made a difference in the way they fought Che. So Felix and the CIA worked with the Bolivian government to say, let's prime the pump a little bit. And so they went and dropped leaflets over the Bolivian countryside offering over $4,000 reward for any information that led to the capture of Che. So now all of a sudden the people were looking for him. And basically the people were looking for the vanguard. The people were looking for any of Che's forces. Because the key was that piece of intelligence. Where are the recon forces? Where is the vanguard? Because then we can catch Che. And so by late September, the death of a man named Antonio, who was the vanguard commander, His real name was Miguel. We don't even know his last name, or at least I don't know his last name. He's really just kind of these one name, like Cher kind of thing. I mean, it's a nom de guerre, right? It's a name of war, just like Che is as well. Prompts Felix to realize, you know what? We know where the vanguard is. All right, that means Che is nearby. And so the forces are sent in. Felix actually has to convince the Bolivian army of this broader idea, like this I guess a theory or a hypothesis of his, that if we can figure out where the vanguard is, we know where Che is. And eventually he does. Eventually he convinces, look, I know what the hell I'm talking about. We now know where the vanguard is. Send everybody you got. And so the Bolivian army finally agrees. And on October 8th, so I guess a week from Friday? No, a week from Monday. Someone tell me when October 8th is. A week from Monday, thank you. During a battle with the forces that Felix sends in because he finds the vanguard, Che is shot in the leg several times. And one of his aides tries to pick him up and run away when his aide is shot, though, also. And the firing is very vicious. He almost gets killed. His beret is shot off his head. So luckily he had it kind of sitting up a little bit high, or he might have been dead. But someone basically hits right the star in his beret and he gets knocked off his head. But Che keeps on fighting. He's lying on the ground. He's shooting from the hip. This is somebody who is not going to go down without going down swinging. And by that time, he's encircled at about 10 yards distance. So he's basically in the middle of this circle of Bolivian army soldiers, and he's still fighting away. The Rangers keep trying to shoot him. Maybe they skipped that week of marksmanship training. But they keep hitting Che in different parts of his body. He can't keep his gun up with only one arm. He's hit again in his right leg, so now he's been shot several times. The gun is shot out of his hand as his forearm is hit. And the soldiers approach. He shouts, "Do not shoot. I am Che Guevara, and worth more to you alive than dead." And he wasn't wrong about that. So about 3:30 in the afternoon that day, the battle ends and Che is taken prisoner. So Felix actually zooms in as fast as he possibly can. I'm almost done, I see you in the back. Felix zooms in as fast as he possibly can because this is a situation that he's been waiting for. He arrives at this small old schoolhouse that they had kind of turned into a mini prison for the people and walked in, and he actually describes the situation he found as gruesome. Che lying in the dirt. He hadn't showered or cleaned himself in months. His arms were tied behind his back, blood all over the place. His feet were bound together. The bodies of his dead friends were just kind of sitting around him because the Bolivians just kind of dumped everybody in the same room. And decides to do exactly what he did with Paco, to treat him like a man, to make sure that he's taken care of, to make sure the doctors come in, to talk to him, to do everything he can. And asked later on why he didn't just walk in and just start kicking the living bejesus out of the guy. I mean, a lot of us would have had those emotions, right? This is kind of the epitome of evil sitting there in front of you. And you finally have a chance to go head to head with him. He said, "I had mixed emotions when I first arrived there. Here was the man who had assassinated many of my countrymen. And nevertheless, when I saw him, the way he looked, I felt really sorry for him." So Che just looked pathetic when he kind of did it. So Rodriguez immediately starts to photograph documents, photograph Che's diary, all the things that were part of the capture of Che. And then the question became what to do with him. What do we actually do with Che? Right? Do we try him? Do we execute him? Do we kind of ship him back to the United States? Well, people had different ideas about this, and this is where kind of the controversy comes in. The possibility of prosecuting him is ruled out by the Bolivians because a trial would focus world attention on him, would give him a lot of what he really wanted, what he coveted at this point, was attention to his cause, and would really bring a lot of sympathetic propaganda for Cuba and for Che. So we're not going to try him. Plus, it's not like Bolivian jails were like Alcatraz. Right? The real fear was that an army would show up and try to break him out and kind of run off into the sunset. So the Bolivians concluded that Che must be executed immediately. No waiting, no trial, we need to do this right away. But the real story that they would put out in public was that he had died during battle. That's problematic for a lot of reasons. We'll talk about that in a second. Now, Felix, on the other hand, had orders to keep Che alive at all costs. The CIA wanted Che. He's better alive than dead. He can provide years and years worth of intelligence on the Castro regime and on all of these Marxist movements throughout Latin America. So Felix stalls. He stalls as long as he can. He's the guy on the ground that's nominally in command. The problem is now the Bolivian president's involved, the Bolivian government's involved, and the Bolivians are ultimately in control. We can say all we want to. The U.S. government can make phone calls. The U.S. government can protest. The U.S. government can say, keep him alive. But you're in Bolivia. The Bolivians are ultimately the ones that are going to make the final decision about this. And that's something that actually Felix tells Che. He's like, look, I'm trying to keep you alive. I'm trying to make sure that we can bring you back and have a conversation with you, but they won't do it. You're going to be executed. And Che actually says he understands. He says, it's better like this. I should have never been captured alive. And Che gives Rodriguez a message for his wife and for Fidel Castro. So, go please tell them I fought fighting. And then they hugged each other. Actually, they hugged each other for a little while. This is a really weird scene. Again, it's kind of hard. These are two men who were mortal enemies, but they truly respected each other. And then Rodriguez leaves the room, and then hears gunshots. Che's final words, apparently, with the young NCO, the young sergeant, Bolivian sergeant that was sent in to kill him, he said, I know you have come to kill me. Shoot, you're only going to kill a man. See, I had a witty little kind of go down fighting thing to say at the very end. Now, this picture is actually an interesting one. This is the last picture of Che alive. Felix is on the left. So that's Felix on the left, dressed like a Bolivian soldier. Right? The CIA needed to make sure that he wasn't wearing like a CIA jacket inside Bolivia. So he's undercover as a Bolivian soldier. And what you don't see in it, the story that Fidel tells about this, what you don't see, the reason I have watched the birdie on there is, so he's setting up this picture, the Bolivian soldier with the camera is trying to figure out how to do it. And Felix says to Che, what translates into English, the Spanish phrase, basically saying, watch the birdie, and kind of like, his hand is behind him and kind of like puts bunny ears up behind him. And the sad part is apparently Che busts out laughing. Just like the humanity of this moment, of these two mortal enemies just kind of joking with each other and like, watch the birdie. And Che just busts out laughing, but then realizes the picture's about to be taken, and then you get the face that you have there. But if the Bolivian, had been able to figure out how to use the camera a couple seconds earlier, we could have had this just wonderful human relationship between these two men instead of this pathetic guy sitting there, dying like this. So there's been a lot of controversy, I want to end on this, about the fact that the CIA really didn't try all that hard to prevent Che from being killed. A lot of people have actually, Fidel has purposely said that Felix went down there to kill Che. Felix himself, let me go back to this picture, in his house. His house, this is his house in South Florida, it is fortified. Like the door to get in is this thick. He's got cameras everywhere because the Cubans and a lot of people around the world want Felix dead because Felix is the reason that Che is dead. And Felix swears, he's like, my whole mission was to keep him alive. But there's conspiracy theories about the CIA wanted him dead. There's some pictures of Che dead, there you go. But there are documents, not only is Felix word matter, there are documents that tell us that we did not, as a country, want Che dead. So I'll read this for you. The second, CIA tells us the latest information is that Guevara was taken alive. After a short interrogation to establish his identity, the general on the time ordered him shot. I regard this as stupid, but it's understandable from a Bolivian standpoint given the problems of sparing a French communist, etc. So this is from McGeorge Bundy, who was the national security advisor to President Johnson. I regard this as stupid. Now, not only do we have this, but the CIA, we know from a fact, we've seen documents, we know that the CIA and the US government actually arranged helicopters and airplanes that were on standby to take Che to Panama for interrogation. So we had put all the steps in place in order to get Che out of Bolivia and put him in interrogation in Panama. So I kind of really worry when people say like the CIA went down there to kill Che, because all the evidence, all the historical evidence flies in the face of that. Today, there's an industry surrounding Che Guevara in Latin America. The people in Bolivia, Bolivia has gone very left. Evo Morales was the president, a avowed Marxist. The people in Bolivia around that area said that when he was killed, this picture, he looked like Christ. So Che looked like Jesus when he was executed. People still in that area of Bolivia pray to Saint Ernesto. They say he grants miracles. There's tours. It's a cottage industry now. Tours of the hospital laundry, which is actually what you're seeing here, where his body was displayed. And a lot of the unmarked tombs where him and his people were buried were all now become tourist traps. In fact, last year, on the 9th of October, which was the day that he was actually killed, 10,000 people descended on this area called La Higuera in Bolivia to commemorate the anniversary, the 50th anniversary of the death of Che. Social activists, regional leaders, Cuban functionaries, even Che's children, so leftists from around the world. And of course, they erected monuments and cultural centers. So these are ones actually in Havana right now. The one on the right is a massive lit up neon Che head that you can see from all different areas in Havana. I mean, it is massive. There's one of Cienfuegos, actually, also the guy with the hat that I talked about earlier. And this is the monument to Che's life. And then I'll end with me hanging out with Camilo and Che in Havana. Che's sneaking up on me even then, trying to come up and grab me. This is a part of the Museum of the Revolution in Havana. If you ever get a chance, it's amazing because they really take this stuff seriously. So they did a whole diorama of Che looking all sneaky for whatever reason. And that is it. And I will answer any questions. Oh, I'm sorry. For those of you that just had eye surgery, that's Che. That's Camilo Cienfuegos. That's me. That's me 20 pounds ago and shaved. And that's in Havana. What questions do you have?
First, I want to say that was quite a rollicking experience. Thank you so much. All right. Woo!
She's right there next to you. Yeah.
She snuck up on you like that.
Yes, good morning. Very excellent presentation. Appreciate
Thank you.
it. After he died, it's also a story with his body. The hands were cut, sent, I don't know where, maybe you know.
Yep.
And then his body disappeared, buried in Bolivia for about 30 years. Can you tell us briefly that?
So they cut off his hands and then cremated the rest of the body. So the body disappeared into ashes and then was buried in an unmarked grave. It was found. Actually, it was found and repatriated back to Cuba. The one on the left here is actually the tomb of Che inside Havana. Now, they cut off his hands for identification purposes. They wanted to get his fingerprints. They wanted to make sure that, because the worst thing that could have happened was people saying, you really didn't kill Che, the legend continues, he got away, all this stuff. So instead of taking his whole body, which again could have been problematic because of people might have tried to fight to rescue the body because he was that kind of person, they decided, look, we're going to kind of give this guy a pauper's funeral. We're going to cremate the body, but let's cut off the hands so that we can identify him. And it turned out the fingerprints were his. They had all the sorts of stuff from earlier in life. And we know it was him because Felix sat across from him and had long conversations with the guy before he was killed. That's kind of where the controversy came in. Like, where did Che's body go? Like, why did they cut off his hands? But now he is entombed and urned, I guess, would be inside this monument inside Havana.
It sounded as though Castro was kind of anti-Che. How has his image and legend been resurrected in Cuba?
Castro was anti-Che when it served his purposes. And Castro, the answer to every question with Fidel Castro is when it served his purposes. Castro realized that Che's death reinvigorated kind of this mystique. And so no longer was he a problem, right? They were best friends. And the only reason there was this breakup was because Che was vehemently and vocally speaking out against the Soviet Union and calling for a world revolution. Well, in Che's death, that's not a problem anymore. Not only is it not a problem, but now Che can be held up as this martyr of communism and spreading the Cuban Revolution. So Castro's no idiot, right? He outlived lots of people. We finally assassinated him successfully by just letting him die of natural causes, but we're genius that way. So Castro's not an idiot. He realized that Che in death was even more powerful than Che in life, right? I mean, it's a scene from Star Wars, right? When Obi-Wan Kenobi says, you can strike me down, but I'll become more powerful than you can ever imagine. That's what happened to Che, right? If Che had gone to prison and pictures of him all scrawny and like wearing like essentially like leaves on his feet because he just when he was captured, he was just looking pathetic. If he hadn't died and just kind of went to prison and went on trial, you would not have stupid kids wearing $50 Che sweatshirts, right? But you kill the guy, and all of a sudden he becomes an icon. All of a sudden he's a martyr for the cause. And Fidel wasn't stupid. He realized that right away, that you could use Che's death as an advantage here.
Where does the name Che come from?
It's a childhood nickname. It was, it became his nom de guerre, like this kind of Che Guevara. But he was known as Che, like as a little kid. And I'm not sure if there. No, I know what you're asking. I'm not sure if I know, or if there's a good answer. You might. Okay. Yes, there it is. Great.
Oh, here, may I,
Yeah.
may I go? Here's the mic.
Yeah. So we can all hear.
Che, it's a common way that all Argentinians use to refer to each other. They can say,
Oh, yeah.
Che, let's go have coffee, or Che, let's go have lunch. Che is a way to connect with somebody you want to talk to. But so he used that with all the other people he was talking to because he was Argentinian.
Yeah.
So he was known as Che because he used that word.
That makes a ton of sense.
Yeah.
Good. I'm glad. Thank you for letting us. I mean, that's. There you go. So there's no magic like it's short for Ernesto or anything like that. It was just a name that caught on. Yeah. Yeah. All of. Right.
During his motorcycle memoir years, was he in touch with his family? Were they still supporting him?
Yeah, sure. I mean, he hadn't gone completely off the reservation. I mean, he didn't have a great relationship with his family to begin with. It wasn't bad. It just wasn't great. They certainly understood and supported him going to medical school, but that was really where, that's where the schism began. The idea was he should be a doctor, right? He should be something
Right.
that, these are, any parents would be like, we sent you to medical school, go be a doctor. Don't go off to the mountains in Mexico on this crazy idea. So there was a kind of a mixture there. They kind of, like when we go on a year abroad or start studying, like, no, I'm not going to study engineering. I'm going to study Chaucer. And your parents go, whoa, wait, hold on. Like, we want you to have a job one day. I think there's kind of a similarity there, certainly also. And then when he goes off and becomes a full-fledged revolutionary, they're not particularly happy about it.
And then what's become of his children? He's still.
They're still around. They're now grandchildren in some cases. His brother is still alive or may have just died. There's actually really interesting, like a year and a half ago, his brother wrote a memoir a while ago, but a year and a half ago it was translated into English. It's called My Brother Che, right? Really not hard to remember. And it's heavily ideological. His brother was also a card-carrying communist, a hardcore guy. But if you can read beyond the flowery language, you can actually get a really good insight into who Che was. So his family is still out there, still around. Che would still be relatively young today. I mean, this is a guy who died, he's 39 when he was killed. So 39 in 1967, so would not be old. So a lot of his family is still around, and many of them are believers. All over the place. All over the place. Some are in Argentina. The brother, I believe, is still in Cuba. But yeah, there might be one in the United States too. I haven't followed his kids and grandkids as closely as I need to. I guess I should have anticipated that question. But
Wait.
which
hold on.
one? Yeah.
Wait, you've got
Sorry.
someone with
Which
the
one?
mic.
You showed a picture of Felix Rodriguez. You had said he went over to Vietnam as a contractor, but the picture had him in a U.S. Army
Good question.
uniform.
So this picture is actually from a U.S. Army yearbook. So all the members of Brigade 2506 who went into Cuba, when they got back, were offered an immediate commission into the United States Army. Basically, they said, if you want to become an officer in the Army, you will. You've earned it. And so a lot of them took that offer up, and Felix was one of them. So this is a picture as a lieutenant in the United States Army. He only spent like 8 months in the Army before he resigned to work with CIA. So this is an earlier picture. This is from 1961, not from later on. There are a lot of great, if you Google him, there's a lot of great pictures of him in Vietnam. He actually looks a lot more like that. This is actually in much later in his life, in the 1980s, but he looked like this in the 1960s too. Where he was flying helicopters. He flew 300 helicopter missions in Vietnam, was shot down several times. His back is still screwed up from being shot down. I was going to say shot down in Vietnam, but the answer shot down in Cambodia. where we weren't supposed to be. Certainly not in 1968 and 1969. But yeah, so this is somebody who, the reason he looks very young and is because it's from 1961, not later on.
You still.
Well, you hadn't mentioned his wife, and that you did say which one. So where did the wives live or come from?
A couple of them were kind of jaded, left behind. He married a Cuban girl during his time in Cuba, and they kind of had a bit of a falling out, although he had a couple kids. When he was in Bolivia, he actually had a lover, an East German, who had a nickname Tanya, but her name is Tamara Bunke. And she more than likely was a KGB spy who was planted in Che's forces to keep tabs on him, but they were full-fledged in-love lovers. She was killed a couple days before he was. She died a horrendous death. She was wounded and wounded face down in basically a river, and was trapped and essentially drowned in like that much water. But she died a couple days before he did. Actually, Felix and a team found her body too.
Isn't she in part of that, the big monument?
Oh yeah, no, she's a heroic person also. There's the East Germans, the Soviets, and the Cubans all hold her up as being, someone, a pillar of the revolution. Even certainly the left wing, the far radical left does as well. If you remember the Patty Hearst case, she had taken the nickname Tanya, based on Tamara Bunke's nickname at the time working with Che. So, and they look very similar.
Yeah.
If you Google them side by side, they looked, very so. So there were no wives that were all that happy with him at the end, because he was running around with an East German girl in Bolivia. He basically left his family and his past behind. But there were a couple of exes who, they married Che Guevara, so they probably were true believers in one way or another, so they maybe still believe in the idea, and especially more now that he's dead. But there probably weren't too many people that were around all that sad about his passing. Any last questions? Yes, right here.
You started your talk with the picture of the passport that Che used in Bolivia. Is there information about disguises that he used in the various countries that he tried to enter or did enter?
He didn't use, this is his most elaborate disguise. In many cases, he would kind of like put glasses on, or he'd put a hat, or he'd shave. This is the most elaborate one because he knew that kind of the whole world was looking for him at this point. He really didn't have to put on a disguise to go into the Congo because there really wasn't a lot of passport control and kind of modern things there. So this was the most elaborate. There were a lot of interesting ways, and I almost got my hands on this if it wasn't for the... So I took a trip, the reason I have a picture of me in Cuba is I took a trip down there to try to convince them to give us stuff. This is during the 3 months of the thaw during the Obama administration. In fact, I was there a week before Obama was there. And we had convinced all these museums down there to loan stuff to us for the new museum. Like, how cool would it be to have Che's radio or something? But the military got involved and said no. But he had some extraordinary ways of moving stuff around. Like, there's the Che Guevara gallery in the Museum of the Revolution is weird. You walk in and there's dolls and there's pots and there's all is this Che's living room? No, these are all the things that he smuggled stuff in. So the doll was hollowed out, and that's how you put weapons and plastic explosives inside the doll. And there was another shoe where in the heel he sent messages to Castro inside the shoe. He understood spy tradecraft very, very well. So it's not a surprise that he was able to disguise himself. He shaved and he kind of put a bald cap on, so it wasn't that great of a disguise. But he understood some of the basics of doing clandestine communication and surreptitious entry and things like that. He kind of was self-taught. This is the kind of stuff you learn not by going to CIA Training Center in Virginia. This is stuff you learn by spending years in the mountains and trying to fight a guerrilla war. And so he was very good at that point, certainly by going into Bolivia, at that point of going to Bolivia, very good at covering his tracks, understanding how to communicate and sneak in. But he never really had to do it to that level beforehand. His other big adventure into the Congo just didn't have that same kind of difficulty getting in and out. Does that make sense? No.
Okay, last question.
I might have time for two.
Why do you think he has cachet today with young kids? What is it about him?
He's a romantic, right? I mean, he's this romantic, and he's a true believer. I mean, I think to me, look, he has cachet with me. I think his ideas are crap.
They don't have sweatshirts with his passport photo on it, though.
Right. Well, look, I don't agree with his ideals, but you have to kind of sit back and go, you know what? Number one, he never, ever said, I'm going to do what I think is more expedient, or I'm going to do what I think is more logical, or I'm going to do what I think is more politically correct, and give up my ideals. And you kind of have to respect that. I mean, Felix respected that. You have to look at him and go, look, I think your ideas suck, but I respect you for never jeopardizing, never going back against them. And I think that people today just don't know the history behind the ideas. They just look at somebody who is romantic, he wants to wander around, he's a true believer. It's the same reason that Lenin, and Lenin's better in many cases, I mean, but it's the same reason that people look at romantic writers and others, Hemingway. Hemingway was a card-carrying communist. He's a member of the KGB. He spied on the United States, not well, but he's a true romantic. He's a true believer, and you look at that, and Che was too. So I understand. I mean, I've read the Motorcycle Diaries, I've read his other memoirs, I've read his brother's book, and I'm reading this going, his ideas are terrible, but I get why people were so drawn into him, because he just really believed them. And he believed in good. His version of good wasn't my version of good, but he believed in there was a good in the world. And that can be very seductive. All right, well, thank you very much, guys.